Moon Knight is a character I've enjoyed for most of my life, ever since I first saw him in Marvel Ultimate Alliance back in the day. I just thought he looked really cool, and he's still pretty cool to this day. But I've noticed he's got something of a bad reputation. A lot of people who aren't Moon Knight fans have this misconception that he's a dollar store Batman, which feels really reductive. To a certain extent, if you just look at the surface level, there's something there. They're both rich vigilantes in capes that throw thematically appropriate objects at their enemies and also have a mustached identity that they use to get intel. I will openly admit that in the first decade or so of his existence, yeah, he was a lot closer to Neil Adams' era Batman, but he's very much grown into his own distinct character over the years, so it really grinds my gears to see so many people dismiss such a great character over it. I've never particularly cared for the criticism that X is just a knockoff of Y. Deadpool was openly a parody of Deathstroke, but no one holds that against him all these years later. And what no one really tends to bring up in this conversation is that Batman himself wasn't any different from any other pulp hero such as the Shadow for a while, mainly due to Bob Kane coming down with an unhealthy dose of plagiarism, but that's besides the point. DC's most original character indeed. To illustrate why I think this is a silly point, let's try a thought experiment. Close your eyes and I'll describe a comic book character, and you have to decide if I'm talking about Batman or someone else. Ready? This is by far the most popular character in his respective publishing universe, someone who was orphaned at a young age and used a traumatic death of someone close to him as motivation to prevent it from ever happening to anyone else. His main father figure in his life is an older man who raised him as if he was his own child after the death of his parents and taught him right from wrong. His main nemesis is a cackling lunatic dressed in purple and green who's notorious for killing a loved one and prominent sporting character. He's a respected genius known for inventing unique gadgets that help him fight crime, including but not limited to his utility belt. Arguably his worst flaw is blaming himself for everything that happens and insisting he handle it himself. He's built up something of a found family over the years, including but not limited to a successor in the far future who wears red and black, the edgy one who's far more open to killing their enemies, and a young partner who may one day fully take on his duties for him, usually after he dies in these stories. His other villains include a desperate scientist who turns himself into an animal monster while attempting to cure his disability, a serial killer who kills because nihilism, Lord knows how many mob bosses with gimmicks, and a genius who's rarely a physical threat, so he relies on hallucinations instead. Now that I said all that, sounds an awful lot like Batman, doesn't it? Well, time to open your eyes because I was talking about Spider-Man this whole time. So, by the same metric that Moon Knight is often judged by, would Spider-Man be a Batman knockoff? This is ultimately my point of this video. Even if there are similarities, especially in their early years, it's their differences that really matter. So let's go over these differences and highlight what makes Moon Knight such a great character, shall we? And I'm gonna get this out of the way now because I know someone's gonna say it. I am not saying one of these characters is necessarily better than the other. I'm simply highlighting their differences to show why they're both good characters in their own right. So, first things first, I think the biggest difference between the two is that Moon Knight fans can actually handle differing opinions. Okay, jokes aside, despite both being pretty wealthy, they got their money through very different means. Mark Spector was the son of a rabbi, so not exactly the old money billions Bruce Wayne is accustomed to. Mark actually did work for his money, being what he managed to save up through years of mercenary work before his near death, or maybe actual death? Who knows, certainly not Mark himself, which segues nicely into the next key difference I see between these two characters, their motivation. We all know what drives Batman at this point. Dark alley, 2 shots in the dark, and a young Bruce Wayne vowing to ensure no child ever has to suffer what he did, which is a very altruistic reason to do what he does. Mark's reason for being a street-level vigilante, however, isn't so altruistic. After being left for dead in the desert, Mark, seemingly, makes a deal with the Egyptian god Khonshu for a second chance at life, in exchange for being Khonshu's knight, protecting and avenging those who deserve justice.
You have a choice, Mark Spector. Do you want death, or do you want life?
I want to live.
Then you will be mine. You will be my hands, my eyes, my vengeance.
It's not that Mark doesn't care about saving others, but his core reason for doing so is due to the terms of his agreement with Khonshu. Actually, you know what just came to mind just as I was writing this video? If we're comparing him to any DC character, you know who Moon Knight does kind of remind me of? Azrael, even though he predates Azrael by nearly 2 decades. The night motif, occasionally sharing a similar color scheme, their devotion to a god who may or may not actually be there, and their tendency to suffer from episodes of psychosis. I'm not saying one ripped from the other necessarily, just a fun observation I just noticed. But back on track, Batman doesn't really have this connection with some thematically appropriate god aside from kind of being connected to Barbatos and Dark Knight's metal, but that's a pretty flimsy connection and an entirely different connection than what Mark has. And you may have noticed my tendency to throw in phrases like seemingly and maybe when detailing Moon Knight's origin, which leads me to the next key point of divergence between these two. We know for a fact why Batman is the way he is. He can create the entire incident in his mind at a moment's notice, and virtually every password and number lock is set to remind him of it. We know his backstory without a shadow of a doubt. But Mark Spector doesn't have that benefit. Mark suffers from the 1-2 combo of both dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia, so he is the unreliable narrator of his own life. It's unclear just how much influence Khonshu has on his life, or if the Khonshu he sees is even real to begin with. And it's that ambiguity that makes Mark such an interesting character to follow. We ultimately don't know if his backstory is entirely true, or if his nightlife as Moon Knight is actually what we're reading at any given moment. This is something that didn't even feel out of left field when it was implied it was all a delusion in his head during Jeff Lemire's run. Or was the mental hospital the delusion? Who's to say? Certainly not Mark. So that's the schizophrenia covered, but how does the DID affect his life? Well, Mark has at least 2 other alters that we know of: Stephen Grant, the wealthy socialite and movie producer, and Jake Lockley, lower-class taxi driver. And this is the key difference between Batman and Moon Knight's personas. With Bruce, it's as simple as a costume change, but with Mark, it's a genuine mental illness that took him years to really come to terms with. Stephen Grant can come off as similar to Bruce, but the mustache personas used to gather street-level info are quite different. Jake Lockley is a true man of the people. He's friends with just about everyone and is just generally chummy, getting valuable info just by chatting with people. This is a far cry from Batman's Matches Malone persona, a hardened gangster shamelessly stolen from a real criminal who died years ago, since it's nice to already have connections set up for you. And I think this also shows a key distinction between the two: their methods. Whereas Batman is seen by some as a dangerous menace to society, Moon Knight is actually a dangerous menace to society, as shown by how he deals with criminals. Batman is infamous for his prep time and methodical planning, striking from the shadows to inspire fear. Moon Knight, however, inspires fear just by being himself. I don't think this man has ever formed an intricate plan in his entire life and prefers to improvise. For example, the mercenary Taskmaster has been hired to stop the hero. Taskmaster's claim to fame is being able to copy any skill just by watching it. So, how would both of them deal with him? Well, Batman would probably use stealth and his good old-fashioned prep time to set up some kind of trap to get the upper hand. But what does Moon Knight do? And I can guarantee you won't guess this outcome unless you've already read this comic run beforehand. Moon Knight elects to avoid the fight entirely by crashing a helicopter straight into him. Good God, man! It's for this exact reason that Taskmaster now fears and refuses to fight him, after what Tasky refers to as his own personal 9/11. It's either 0 or 100 with this guy. He doesn't do subtle. He even wears the white because he wants his targets to see him coming. And how they deal with criminals is ultimately indicative of their vastly different worldviews. Batman would gladly negotiate and reach out with compassion if it could avoid a fight, but Moon Knight will gladly just bash their face in and call it a day. Maybe cut their face off as a sacrifice to his possibly fictional god if he's feeling extra spicy that day. He even doesn't really have a strict moral code. He just generally doesn't kill people if he can help it. Generally. Needless to say, I can really only see one of them comforting a scared child if the situation arises, and that's completely fine. Not every vigilante needs to adhere to the same set of morals. Bruce Wayne is completely capable of being compassionate. He's strong enough to be gentle, but there's nothing kind or gentle in Mark Spector. And this is another clear line between the two. Mark is completely aware of his issues. He's accepted that there's no easy cure for his mental illnesses. and he's learned to live with them rather than be consumed by them. I am sick. I know that. I will never be cured. This is always going to be who I am, but I can still live. I can still have a life, and I won't let you ruin that for me anymore.
Please, you need me.
No, Khonshu. I am Mark Spector. I am Stephen Grant. I am Jake Lockley. And we are going to be okay. We are going to live with who we are. We are Moon Knight, and we never needed you. He even goes to therapy in Jed McKay's run. How often do you really see Batman, voluntarily, go to therapy? That actually makes for a good transition. What exactly does Mark discuss during his therapy sessions? Well, quite a few things, including but not limited to his religious upbringing. Mark was not only raised Jewish, but also raised by a rabbi, so needless to say his religion is a pretty big part of who he is, and being conflicted by serving an entirely different god than the one he grew up being told stories of. He even gets a card from fellow Jewish superhero Ben Grimm every year. That's nice of him. This is a pretty big difference from Bruce Wayne, who's pretty consistently depicted as an atheist, which is actually kind of funny considering how many actual gods he's met, and more often than not punched in the face at least once. Batman is occasionally implied to have practiced religion at some point in his life, but has long since lapsed, and even then, no one can even agree what religion it even was. So, needless to say, the only faith tied to his character is faith in other human beings rather than any specific higher power. There is one last major difference that I think has impacted both characters and their worldviews. They both had pretty polar opposite relationships with their families. Bruce adored his parents and still idolizes them as an adult. Mark didn't have bad parents per se, but they're definitely not winning any parenting awards anytime soon. Like I said earlier, Mark's father Elias was a rabbi, something that caused him and his brother Randall to be pretty aggressively bullied over. Mark would fight back to protect himself and his brother, but Elias is the ultimate pacifist, and instead of doing anything about the bullying, he was only ever disappointed with his kids for their violent behavior. And to top it all off, once Mark started developing DID after a traumatic incident, Elias just shipped him off to the Putnam Psychiatric Hospital, where he stayed up until the day his father died. It's because of this that Mark now resents his father, firmly believing Elias was ashamed of his son until the day he died. His mother, on the other hand, doesn't get nearly as much panel time, but from the few times she does appear, she's dismissive at best, hand-waving her son's violent tendencies as boys will be boys behavior whenever Elias brings it up, and at worst, treats Mark's mental health issues as an inconvenience to her. You know, Batman has had a really rough life even before becoming the Bat, but at least he has Alfred, the number one dad in the entire DC universe, there to support him. You know who Mark has? Khonshu. His relationship with Khonshu is like that of a gaslighting, self-centered parent, but on a divine level. He'll act kind and encouraging towards Mark just enough to keep him dependent. Even when he gets sick of Khonshu's scrap, he's so desperate for the validation that he just keeps coming back because Mark feels he just doesn't have anything left. His service to Khonshu has caused him to burn every single bridge he has in his life until all that's left is his service to Khonshu. And when Mark dares try to live his life outside of the mission, Khonshu shows his true colors. The closest thing Mark has to a parental figure is a vindictive, petty, and cruel creature who makes sure Mark is fully aware of what a disappointment he is. So with all that in mind, I think both characters are quite different in all the ways that matter. But the crew in charge of the Disney Plus show completely missed that memo, and in a misguided attempt to subvert the Batman comparisons, overcorrected to the point where everything that made the character fun and interesting was completely wiped away, and all that was left is this overly sanitized, Disney-fied version that's no different from virtually any other MCU hero currently active. And this was a deliberate choice by the crew, with a head writer admitting he doesn't even like Moon Knight and has never read the comics, and just wanted to tell an Indiana Jones story, fitting a square peg in a round hole to do it. Kevin Feige certainly doesn't care about Moon Knight and just hired people who also have a lot of 80s nostalgia, and a director who gets bored by action scenes, apparently. I remember how excited I was to hear Feige talking about how visceral the violence would be in the show, and how they weren't gonna pull any punches, only to pull punches every chance they get and to just cut back when it's all said and done. But I'm not just gonna sit here and complain about my superheroes not being violent enough. How was he written in the show? Oscar Isaac is some mighty fine casting, but man, he was given some lousy material to work with. First off, I think is the cardinal sin of any Moon Knight story, completely removing any ambiguity he has. Khonshu is in fact real, and so are all the monsters Mark fights. And not only that, but his suit isn't just a suit. It's in fact an enchanted suit of armor that he can just summon at will. I love how the suit looks, really leaning into the Egyptian inspiration, but being a full-on mystical artifact that gives him actual superpowers is where I draw the line. Mark himself has been turned into a sort of globe-trotting adventurer with no connection to street-level threats, and I have a sneaking suspicion they amped him up to a larger-scale powerhouse to shove him on whatever Avengers roster comes next, which really isn't where he needs to be. The most egregious example of how drastically the character has been changed is how they approach the other alters. How did they approach Stephen Grant, movie producer and wealthy socialite, you may ask? He's a sniveling idiot who's utterly useless in a fight and would rather crack stupid jokes instead of contributing anything actually helpful. And that alone is the most painful thing in the entire show to watch. And I say that keeping the horrific abuse flashbacks from Mark's childhood in mind. But enough about Steven with a V. What does Jake Lockley do in the show, given that his entire role as a down-to-earth, street-level informant is rendered completely moot? Oh, he's the evil alter stereotype. Yeah, throughout the show it just cuts back to the aftermath of a particularly violent fight that I'd like to see instead of a sky laser and a magic kaiju battle, and both Mark and Steven act shocked at what they're seeing, and the big post-credit teaser is that there's a third alter, who has no qualms straight up murdering whoever Khonshu says to murder. So, instead of the chummy, down-to-earth taxi driver everyone loves, we just had to play into a harmful DID cliche because he otherwise has no reason to exist. Great. And I hope you're not expecting the show to address his religion at all. You know, a major part of his personal conflict. Yeah, nah, the only reference to it is Mark wearing a yarmulke for a minute or two during his mother's funeral. Because we can't have openly Jewish superheroes in a Disney universe or good old Walt would roll over in his grave. The show is competently made and all, and there are a lot of good things about it, but this is just not the character I came here to watch. I'm all for putting your own spin on an established character, but if the changes aren't interesting enough to justify what you're taking away, just don't do it. In an attempt to make Moon Knight more unique and separate from Batman, all the MCU crew ended up doing was making him sanitized and generic. But with all that being said, if I managed to convince you guys to check Moon Knight out to see what makes him such a good character firsthand, go ahead and read the runs I have on screen right now. And I'll see you guys in the next video. If you've made it this far, then I sincerely thank you for watching, and make sure to look away from your screen for at least 20 seconds to reduce eye strain. This is Major Disaster signing off.